Launching the Antiquities Act of 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt created the nation's first national monument designation, Devil's Tower National Monument in Wyoming. The important purpose of this act was to preserve, for all Americans, significant pieces of the country's history. Ecology. Geology. And beauty. But unlike America's great national parks, size is not important for monuments. Historic sites and other units of the national park system. Monuments are typically established by presidential proclamation, chosen as their personal memorials of the most special parts of this great country. However, occasionally these units of the park system are established by the direct action of Congress. Some are big, some are small. Some garner large budgets and staff, others next to none. And some eventually gain national park designation. America's treasures tell the story of the nation's past and present glory. It is perhaps the most treasured landscape in America. The Southern Rocky Mountains. The Southern Rockies extend from Wyoming through Colorado down to New Mexico. Commonly known as the Rockies, it is one of the most spectacular sections of mountains on the planet. Most of the range is above 10,000 feet. It is the highest region on the North American continent. And it contains many of the highest peaks in the whole Rocky Mountain range. Rugged mountains with their glacier-carved and snow-capped peaks that are a wonder to view. In fact, these snow-capped peaks are the headwaters for some of the nation's most important river systems. Like the 1,450-mile-long Colorado River, cutting its way through the Southwest on its way to the Pacific Ocean. At the same time, supplying water for the major cities along California's southern coast. And water for the vast agricultural production in the Imperial Valley. Then there is the Rio Grande, the Arkansas, and the Platte rivers that flow east to the Atlantic Ocean. The Rockies are also renowned for their aspen forests. Renowned for their spring wildflowers. Renowned for their high-elevation sagebrush habitats. And intermountain valleys. And renowned for their amazing collection of wildlife. Mule deer. Vast herds of elk readily observable. observable during all 4 seasons. Bighorn sheep, moose, black bear, and mountain lions captured here on this trail cam just outside of Rocky Mountain National Park. Rocky Mountain National Park, located in Colorado, is the premier destination for visitors to the Southern Rockies. A park that encompasses both sides of the Continental Divide and offers visitors experiences of every aspect of the magnificent Southern Rockies. A casual observer of a map of the Southern Rockies will notice how many of the features have names like Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the San Juan Mountains, and the San Luis Valley. Names that remind people of the early Spanish colonization of the area from 1598 to 1680. Colonization that came in contact with the native Pueblo people. A contact that is preserved and represented at Pecos National Historical Park, as well as the stunning sand dunes that are preserved in Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve along the edge of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. In a century filled with famous explorers, Brigadier General Zebulon Pike was perhaps America's greatest. Pike was the first American to discover the stunning beauty of the Southern Rocky Mountains. His journal from January 28, 1807 reads, "After marching some miles, we discovered at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, which we were then descending, sandy hills. When we encamped, I ascended one of the largest hills of sand, and with my glass could discover a large river, the Rio Grande. The sand hills extended up and down the foot of the White Mountains about 15 miles, and appeared to be about 5 miles in width. Their appearance was exactly that of the sea in a storm, except as to color. This is an experience every visitor to Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve can have for themselves. In the early morning light, the ever-shifting dunes draw you to them like a magnet." In 1932, President Herbert Hoover designated the Great Sand Dunes as a national monument. The immense popularity of the park resulted in the monument's expansion in the 21st century to become Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve. There's nothing like these dunes in North America. They are, in fact, the tallest dunes on the continent. But it is best to know something about the dunes before beginning your exploration of this amazing feature. Fred Bunch is resource manager for the park.
The high dune is an example of a star dune. It has 4 arms. And then you have reversing dunes. And reversing dunes are when you have the bimodal winds opposing each other. And after usually a frontal system goes down the front range and it pushes the ridge back and it creates what we call the Chinese walls and the reversing dunes. And then out on the flats, there's parabolic dunes where there's vegetation and they are in shape of a parabola. But controlled by vegetation. And then there's Bacan or Barcan dunes that flip 180 degrees from the parabolic and the arms point with the wind. So there's a lot of different dune types here.
We asked Ranger Bunch to point out some of the different dune types.
High Dune is one of the tallest dunes that the visitors hike to. It's quite an invigorating hike to the top. High Dune is 700 feet above the creek bed. Then if you look over toward the north, you can see reversing dunes, those kind of ridges that go up. And those are a situation where you have wind from the northeast opposing wind from the southwest. And then if you look at where those trees are with the sand around them, those are escape dunes referred to as, because they've escaped from the main dune mass, and they're on the east side of the creek because the creek plays a significant role in transporting sand back around and carrying sand away around the dunes to be blown back in. And so those dunes are also considered climbing dunes because they're climbing up a hill, and they've killed some of those ponderosa pines there by packing sand around them.
It's time to set out for the dunes. But surprise! From spring to late summer, you're suddenly on a beach with waves. A unique wave phenomenon that is found in Medano Creek.
Yeah, Medano Creek is really kind of unique. It flows in front of the dunes, and it's not going to be there all the time. It's going to depend how much moisture is melting from the snow melt in the spring, or if there's been some rain and so on. But this unusual creek comes past the dunes and then just disappears into the sand. It actually reappears much further down the valley if there's enough water. But when it is flowing, it forms these things called anti-dunes underneath the surface of the water, and they're kind of like these little tiny miniature sand dunes under the water, and they kind of dam things up, and then every once in a while they flood out again. And so you get this thing called a surge flow, and it's like having small waves in this little tiny river. And the thing never really gets to be terribly deep, I think the deepest I've ever seen is maybe about a foot deep. And so the kids can play in this thing, and if they don't weigh very much, they can actually kind of surf down it or float down it. Adults probably, we weigh a little bit too much to manage that trick. But it's great fun. It's like going to the beach. You've got a waterway that's very, very safe for kids to be around. They can build their sand castles and so on. And it's got this unique surging thing that it does.
The creek is a wonderful part of this resource, and it's fed by snowmelt in the Sangre Cristo's high up, and then as it flows past the dunes, it flows in a pattern or a dynamic that is world class. It surges. It surges like waves on the beach, and the ripples right before your very eyes build vertically and move upstream until they flush through in a hydrologic leap and only to start again. So it's a pulsating flow, and it's periodic. You can actually time them by your watch depending on how much water there is.
Most of the people that we've seen just kind of wade in a little bit, walk around, and that's about it. But the kids, of course, they really get into the waves that come down when the sand builds up.
Experienced mountain climbers Charlie and Diane Winger have written the definitive field guide to Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve. They know that climbing the sand dunes is the everyday person's equivalent to reaching one of the summits of a nearby mountain peak.
It's kind of like looking at why did you climb that mountain? Because it's there. Not too many people find dunes nearby that they get to go play around on. It's sort of like an enormous sand box to go play in. There's something challenging about saying, well, can I just at least get to the top of something and get a different viewpoint, get good views and so on.
The dunes are unique. They don't have them in every state, and so as you stand back and look at them different times of the day, and they just kind of draw you. You want to get up there, and then you see people doing that. Why do we all climb to the highest of whatever? And it's the same way with the sand dunes, and you see these different shadows and things. And for me, at least, if I see a sand dune or something like that, I want to climb up to the highest point.
The climbing is not easy. It's almost 2 steps up, 1 step back. Slippery. Confusing. Sand shifting. Along the way, look for animal tracks. And finally, a summit is reached. Sit back and enjoy the view. To the south is the San Luis Valley.
So that's one of the fun things is when you climb up on High Dune or even just any of the dunes and you look out and you see this huge, vast, very flat valley, just desert, and turn around to the other side and here are these spectacular mountains, including several 14ers. So often they have are snow-capped. So it's a gorgeous setting. I don't think there's anything like it anywhere else in the world.
And then it's downhill. Fun for the whole family. Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve is perhaps the only place in the national park system where the primary feature and resource can be fully experienced and utilized with great freedom and joy. When your time at the park is over and you're looking back at the alluring dunes, there is a tremendous feeling of satisfaction and accomplishment. The sand dunes are ever shifting, a changing geographical feature. Yet at the same time, they are not changing at all. The science behind this phenomena is a result of unique conditions and forces found in this one place.
The Great Sand Dunes are a result of a lot of earth processes, the tail of two mountain ranges. To the west, the San Juan Mountains started forming over 30-some million years ago as volcanic activity. And largely associated with the Rio Grande Rift, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains were formed by a fault blocking or an uplifting episode. They say earth is the anvil and weather's the hammer. Whether you build mountains by volcanoes or by faulting, then erosion kicks in, and the San Luis Valley is a depositional basin. Deposits from both the San Juans and the Sangre de Cristos fill in this basin, and then there was a large volcanic activity in the southern part of the San Luis Valley around 2.5 million years ago that dammed the Rio Grande River and created Lake Alamosa. And Lake Alamosa deposited the blue clay, and then about 400,000 years ago that lake breached and it left behind a lot of deposits, and then in the time since, the prevailing wind has been carrying sand from the southwest to the northeast, where it encounters the Sangre de Cristo Mountains behind us here, and this is a natural trap for the dunes. And these dunes are world class. These are the tallest dunes in North America, and they're a result of this erosional activity, but also bimodal winds from the northeast offsetting the winds from the northwest, and so that stacks them up to great heights, over 750 feet high in elevation. And then the creek plays a role too. The creeks carry sand out past the dune field and in order to be recycled back in. So this time of year when the creeks are really flowing, they're transporting and conveying a lot of sand out into the valley floor.
There is one other force at play, the wind.
The wind is the best sorter of materials, because as the wind blows from the southwest to the northeast to the mountains here, it sorts the materials. The rocks and everything stay out on the valley floor, and the dust goes across the mountains to Kansas, and so the dunes are very finely sorted materials. And so if you're on the dunes, you'll see a lot of different striations where you have avalanche bedding and ripple bedding and all this stuff as a result of this dynamic wind activity.
The San Luis Valley is a spectacular feature in itself. Not only is it the source of the sand for the dunes, but it offers over 3,000 acres of public lands for recreation. And wildlife viewing, particularly when, in the spring and fall, on their annual migration, enormous flocks of sandhill cranes arrive at the wetlands. wetlands associated with the Rio Grande River, as it flows on its way to the Gulf of Mexico, eventually leaving behind the valley and the great sand dunes. If you travel south along the Sangre de Cristo Mountains into New Mexico, you suddenly come across the ruins of Pecos Pueblo and Spanish Mission. In doing so, you have entered Pecos National Historical Park. The park was set aside by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965 as a national monument and was greatly enlarged and renamed Pecos National Historical Park in 1990. The Native Americans who lived in pueblos, like the ruins preserved here, are now believed to be the descendants of the Anasazi, or ancient Pueblo people. Much like the Anasazi before them, these tribes were agriculturalists, living a quiet pastoral life and dwelling in the distinctive Pueblo-style multi-story adobe houses. A quiet life shadowed by the arrival of Spanish conquistadors and missionaries in the 16th century. The story of their contact with the Spanish missionary zealots is written in the many adobe mission ruins scattered throughout the area. From around 1620, Spanish soldiers and missionaries conquered and ruled over the Pueblo Indians for nearly a century. The rule was not benevolent. The Spanish quickly established tyrannical political control by forcing Indians to work Spanish lands in what amounted to slave labor. At Pecos National Historic Park, the bloody story of this encounter is written in the Pueblo and missionary ruins. A 1.25-mile trail winds through the ruins of the Pecos Pueblo and Spanish Mission. The foundations show where a once great Pueblo city-state thrived here. The houses of the Pueblo were arranged in the form of house blocks and were 5 stories high with a central courtyard. Visitors today are invited to enter one of the 2 kivas in the park and experience what it must have been like to be part of some ancient Pueblo religious ceremony. Near the Pueblo, a Spanish Franciscan mission was built in 2 stages. The first stage in the early 1600s, and then a second church was built 100 years later, containing the first church. During the Great Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the Indians drove out the Franciscan missionaries from the Pueblos, and they were forced back into Mexico. However, 14 years later, the Spanish returned and took retribution on the Pueblo people. Eventually, an alliance was formed as the Franciscans moderated their zeal and removed the Pueblo people's tributes to the church. But by 1780, disease and the Comanche raids reduced the population to less than 300 inhabitants. The last survivors of this once thriving city-state left it and abandoned the church for good in 1838. Now all that's left are these ruins and the ghost of the past. However, nearby one can still see and visit the Taos Pueblo. Tucked away in the southern edge of the Rockies, it is a living reminder of the glory days of those long-gone city-states of the Pueblo people.